On the morning of October 27, 1969, a young woman named Mary Stiles walked up to a wrecking ball on Lyon Street in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and chained herself to it. Behind her stood a building that had cost $314,800 to construct 81 years earlier, a high Victorian Gothic City Hall, designed by the same architect who built the Michigan State Capitol. It had a 6-story clock tower with 4 dials, each one 8 feet tall. It had been placed on the National Register of Historic Places 5 months before, and the city was about to knock it down anyway. The wrecking crew paused. Someone offered Stiles a deal. They would lift her on the crane high above the rooftops so she could take one final look at the building she was trying to save. She agreed. They raised her into the air for one last look at the city. Then they brought her down, unhooked the chains, and the wrecking ball went to work. That photograph, a woman suspended from a crane above a doomed building, ran in newspapers across the country. It was the last image most Americans would ever see of old Grand Rapids. But the destruction of that city hall was not the beginning of the story. It was closer to the end. By October of 1969, more than 120 old buildings in downtown Grand Rapids had already been torn down. Entire blocks of family-owned shops, theaters, saloons, and small businesses had been scraped clean and replaced with parking lots and government plazas. A freeway had been punched through the city's center, and the thing that made all of it possible, the thing that made Grand Rapids worth building in the first place, and therefore worth destroying, was wood. The Grand River is the longest river in Michigan, running 252 miles from its headwaters near Jackson to Lake Michigan. 40 miles inland from the lake, the river bends and drops, an 18-foot fall over about 4,000 feet of rapids. The Ottawa Indians had gathered at this spot for centuries, calling the river Owashtenong, meaning faraway waters, and using the rapids as a trading point where several important trails converged. The French translated the name simply Grand River. In November of 1826, a French-Canadian fur trader named Louis Campeau paddled to the east bank near the rapids and built a log cabin, a trading post, and a blacksmith shop. He had $5,000 in trade goods, a government license to deal with the Ottawa, and a younger brother named Toussaint to help with the work. The site where Campeau hammered together his cabin would one day hold the tallest building in the city. He bought the land from the federal government for $25. The next year he went back to Detroit, returned with his wife Sophie, and settled in for good. Campeau's uncle Joseph was said to be the wealthiest man in the Michigan Territory, Detroit's first millionaire. And Louis had the trader's instinct for finding a place before anyone else knew it mattered. By 1831, the federal surveyors arrived and mapped the territory. By 1838, the settlement had incorporated as a village. The first formal census, in 1845, counted 1,510 people. 5 years later, in 1850, Grand Rapids became a city. Population, 2,686. What happened next was lumber, and it happened fast. Michigan's vast forests, white pine that could grow 175 feet tall with stumps 8 feet across, plus dense stands of oak and hardwood, were the last great untouched timber reserve east of the Mississippi. The trees came down in the northern camps, and the logs came south on the rivers. Grand Rapids sat at the perfect convergence. The 18-foot drop at the rapids generated water power for sawmills. The river itself was the highway that delivered the raw material. And by the 1850s, the railroads were arriving to ship the finished product out. Logs floated downstream in such volume that the city had to hire men called river drivers to ride them, guiding the timber to its rightful destination and keeping upstream mill operators from stealing it in a practice they called hogging. The lumberjacks earned between $1 and $3 a day and ate enormously. They wore bright red flannel and spiked boots that chewed up the wooden sidewalks and barroom floors so badly that one hotel owner started handing out carpet slippers at the door. The men spent their pay in days. The lumber barons who employed them invested theirs in something more permanent. East of downtown, on a gentle slope overlooking the river, the wealthy began to build. The neighborhood would become Heritage Hill, eventually one of the largest urban historic districts in the country, with over 1,300 homes representing nearly every style of American architecture from Greek Revival to Prairie. Streets like Cherry, College, and Lafayette, filled with Italianate mansions and Queen Anne houses built with the money that Michigan's forests were generating for the men shrewd enough to stand at the bottom of the river and collect. In 1888, the lumber baron brothers Ethelbert and Charles Fox built a chateau-esque mansion on Cherry Street, designed to look like a Scottish baronial castle, complete with turrets and pointed arches. It still stands. Down the street, bankers and judges built colonial revival homes with wraparound porches. It was the kind of neighborhood where the wealth of an entire region concentrated itself into a few dozen blocks of extraordinary architecture, and where the men who owned the factories could look down the hill toward the river and the smokestacks that were making them rich. But the lumber had a second act that nobody planned for, and it would define Grand Rapids more completely than the timber itself ever did. In 1836, the same year Grand Rapids was surveyed, a man named William Haldane came from Ohio and opened a small cabinet shop, making chairs, beds, tables, and coffins. He was the first, but not the last. The combination was simply too good. Cheap timber floating right to your door, cheap water power from the rapids, railroads to ship the product east and west, and a growing pool of immigrant labor, Germans, Irish, Dutch, Poles, skilled with their hands and willing to work long hours for modest pay. In 1859, Julius Berkey and James Eggleston began making sash, doors, and blinds in a small shop on Erie Street. 3 years later, in 1862, Berkey and a man named Elias Matter pooled their resources. Matter inventoried his tool chest at $6, and Berkey contributed $5 in cash. With $11 between them, they formed a partnership to manufacture furniture for the wholesale trade in Chicago and Milwaukee. That first winter, they worked in a rented portion of a factory on Mill Street. They had no showroom, no reputation, and no capital to speak of. What they had was the river, the wood, and the knowledge that the cities to the west were growing fast and would need places to sit and sleep. That $11 stake would grow into the Berkey and Gay Furniture Company, the largest furniture manufacturer in the United States. George Gay bought a half interest in 1866. William Berkey withdrew. Julius Berkey and George Gay incorporated in 1873, with Berkey as president and Gay as treasurer. In 1874, they built a new 6-story factory with wholesale and retail showrooms on Canal Street. By 1882, the factory complex covered 3 full city blocks: manufacturing, offices, warehouses, shipping docks, lumber yards, and showrooms. Their slogan was, "For your children's heirlooms," and they meant it. Berkey and Gay furniture was built to be inherited. Then came the moment that turned a regional furniture town into a national brand. In 1876, Berkey and Gay shipped an elaborate display of carved Renaissance Revival bedroom suites and secretaries to the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition, the first official World's Fair held in the United States. Nearly 10 million people passed through Fairmount Park that summer. They saw Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. They saw the Corliss steam engine. And they saw, for the first time, what a river town in western Michigan could do with a piece of wood. Berkey and Gay won an award. Buyers from across the country and from Europe saw the display and wanted to know more. Overnight, Grand Rapids became the furniture capital of America. 2 years later, in 1878, the city held its first furniture exhibition, a trade market where buyers could come to Grand Rapids itself to see what all the factories were producing under one roof. Dealers arrived from across the nation. Grand Rapids had invented its own trade show, and it would hold this market for decades. Twice a year, buyers from New York and Chicago and St. Louis, checking into hotels along Monroe Avenue, walking the showrooms, writing orders for parlor suites and dining sets and bedroom furniture that would fill middle-class homes from coast to coast. By the turn of the century, the furniture market was not just an event. It was the economic engine that supported every hotel, every restaurant, and every boarding house in downtown Grand Rapids. The population numbers tell the rest. In 1870, Grand Rapids had 16,507 people. By 1880, 32,016. By 1890, 60,278. By 1900, 87,565. By 1910, the city crossed 112,000. About 1 in every 3 working people in Grand Rapids was employed in some aspect of furniture making, on the factory floor, in the sawmill, in the paint and varnish shop, or in the showrooms. There were 44 furniture companies in the city. By 1884, 61 woodworking firms operated within the city limits, 21 of them making furniture exclusively. The Grand Rapids Furniture Manufacturers Association, formed in 1881, didn't merely represent the industry. It functioned as a cartel. The association maintained a card system that tracked every factory employee, name, immigration status, pay rate, and detailed notes that could be used as leverage. It prevented workers from switching between factories in search of better wages. It allowed companies to blacklist anyone deemed an agitator. The furniture barons, the Berkeys, the Gays, the Widdicomms, the Slights, didn't just make furniture. They chartered the banks. They controlled the credit lines the seasonal factories depended on. They built their mansions on Heritage Hill and attended Fountain Street Church. And they ran Grand Rapids the way a board of directors runs a company, with an expectation that the employees would accept the terms offered. That same year, 1881, Grand Rapids scored another first. One of the country's earliest hydroelectric power plants began operation on the Grand River, giving the factories cheap electricity. And in July of 1883, nature reminded Grand Rapids exactly what its wealth was built on. Heavy rains upstream caused the river to rise nearly 20 inches. An estimated 150 million board feet of timber, logs already cut and floating downstream, broke loose and surged toward the city. When the logs reached bridges and narrow sections of the river, everything stopped. The pileup was almost impossible to comprehend. Logs stacked 30 feet high, stretching 7 miles along the Grand River, the pressure so enormous that it crushed and swept away 2 railroad bridges, the Fulton Street Bridge and the Wealthy Street Bridge. For days, the river was not a river. It was a floating wall of wood. Workers scrambled to break the jam apart before more infrastructure was destroyed. It was one of the largest log jams ever recorded in the United States, and it happened in the middle of a city that owed its existence to the material that was now trying to destroy it. The forests, of course, would not last forever. Michigan's white pine era peaked in the 1880s and declined sharply after 1900. The furniture companies had to start importing their lumber from other states. But by then, the infrastructure, the workforce, the brand name, and the trade show were all in place. Grand Rapids was Furniture City, and for a generation, that seemed permanent. In 1908, Frank Lloyd Wright designed the Meyer May House on Madison Avenue, a prairie-style masterpiece that would later be restored by Steelcase and opened for public tours. The Pantlind Hotel, designed by Warren and Wetmore, the same New York firm that created Grand Central Terminal and the Biltmore Hotel, opened between 1913 and 1915 with over 500 rooms. J. Boyd Pantlind, from a family of reputable Michigan innkeepers, managed it. The hotel was built specifically because the furniture buyers needed accommodations worthy of the business they were bringing. Its lobby featured a gold-leaf domed ceiling, arched windows with brass molding, and 3 massive Czechoslovakian chandeliers made of Austrian crystal, each weighing 4,000 pounds. By 1925, the Pantland was named one of the 10 finest hotels in America. The local television station, WZZM, would later operate its studios out of the building. Otto Seiferth, who carved stone on the hotel's exterior walls during construction, earning 65 cents an hour, would go on to become the 23rd president of the United States Chamber of Commerce. In 1954, Queen Juliana and Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands stayed at the Pantland during an official visit, attending a royal luncheon with 250 guests in a ballroom designed by the same architects who had built Grand Central Terminal. The hotel was not just a place to sleep. It was the physical proof that Grand Rapids had arrived, that a city built on sawdust and wood shavings could hold its own against any city in America. McKay Tower rose on the site where Louis Campeau's log cabin had once stood. The first 2 floors went up in 1915 as the Grand Rapids National Bank. Neoclassical columns, granite surfaces, separate lounges for male and female customers, even a handball court for employees. By 1927, the building had grown to 18 stories, the first skyscraper in Grand Rapids, and its tallest structure for the next 56 years. Frank D. McKay, a Grand Rapids businessman and Republican power broker, bought the tower in 1942 and gave it his name. When he died, he left the building to the University of Michigan. At its peak, around 1928, Grand Rapids had 68 furniture manufacturers. Berkey Gay alone was doing nearly $10 million a year in sales, producing about 1/3 of all the fine period reproduction furniture in the United States. Presidents worked at Grand Rapids desks: Hoover, Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower. During World War I, 15 furniture manufacturers had joined forces to build 1,000 Handley Page bombers. The name Grand Rapids on a piece of furniture meant something specific to the American middle class: quality, craftsmanship, a product built by people who knew wood the way a tailor knows fabric. There is a detail about the furniture markets that matters later. Twice a year, the buyers came to Grand Rapids. Twice a year, the hotels filled, the restaurants boomed, the showrooms opened their doors. The entire commercial life of downtown depended on this rhythm, and the rhythm depended on the factories running. The workers knew this, even if nobody said it out loud. The industry had a fracture running through it, and on April 19, 1911, it cracked open. When the factory whistles blew that morning, more than 6,000 workers, cabinet makers, wood carvers, varnishers, upholsterers, and unskilled laborers, laid down their tools and walked out of 59 Grand Rapids plants. They had been earning roughly $2 a day for 60-hour weeks. They wanted a 9-hour day, a 10% wage increase, and the end of the piecework system that kept their earnings unpredictable. The Furniture Manufacturers Association responded with the tools of a cartel. It brought in scab workers from other cities, pressured local banks to foreclose on strikers' mortgages, and deployed the card system to identify and blacklist anyone who had organized the walkout. A riot broke out at the John Widdicomb Company factory. 4 people were arrested, dozens were hurt, and the factory sustained property damage. The strike split the city along lines of class and faith. The Catholic Auxiliary Bishop Joseph Schrems publicly supported the workers, declaring the labor situation in Grand Rapids most deplorable from every point of view. He was later transferred to the Diocese of Toledo, effectively banished for choosing the wrong side. The Christian Reformed Church, whose Dutch congregants formed a large portion of the workforce, went the other direction. Its leaders issued an edict forbidding members to belong to unions. One by one, workers began returning to their jobs. On August 19, 1911, after 121 days, the remaining strikers voted to end the walkout. They had won almost nothing on paper. But the factory owners, recognizing that another strike would be catastrophic, quietly began granting what they had publicly refused. Most employers increased pay and shortened hours once their employees returned, conceding in practice what they had denied in principle. And 10,000 people marched in the Labor Day parade that September, roughly 10% of the entire population of Grand Rapids, walking through the streets past the Heritage Hill mansions where the furniture barons lived, in a display of solidarity that for one day exceeded anything the owners could suppress or explain away. The owners had won, but they were shaken. In 1916, the furniture barons pushed through a ballot initiative that changed Grand Rapids city charter from a 12-ward system to a 3-ward system, consolidating their political control over a workforce that had shown it could organize. They later established a city manager form of government to further weaken the mayor's office, a direct response to Mayor George Ellis's support of the strikers. That city manager structure remains in effect today, and the residential furniture industry, the specific thing that had put Grand Rapids on the map, the carved bedroom suites and parlor sets that families bought as heirlooms, never fully recovered from the strike. The national slump between 1905 and 1910 had already weakened the companies. Southern manufacturers with cheaper labor were undercutting Grand Rapids prices. The forests that had once floated timber right to the factory doors were gone, and imported lumber cost more. The war brought a temporary boom. 15 manufacturers joined forces to build 1,000 Handley Page bombers. But the peacetime market was softer, more competitive, and Grand Rapids was no longer the only place that could make good furniture. When the Depression arrived, it was devastating. In 1929, at the peak, Berkey Gay was doing nearly $10 million a year in worldwide sales, $8 million by some accounts, operating 5 production plants with 1.5 million square feet of floor space. That same year, the Simmons Company of Chicago bought the firm, hoping to expand its market. But the timing could not have been worse. Sales collapsed as the economy cratered, and by 1931, Berkey Gay declared bankruptcy. The company reorganized in 1935, tried Art Deco and modern styles, produced furniture for a smaller market through the war years, but the numbers never came back. In 1948, Berkey Gay closed for good. The factory complex that had covered 3 city blocks on Canal Street, the company that had won the award at the Philadelphia Centennial, the firm that had started with $11 in cash and tools, gone. The deeper irony is that Grand Rapids was already becoming something else entirely, and the transformation was happening on the factory floor, not in the boardroom. In 1912, 1 year after the Great Strike, 3 men, Peter Wege, Walter Edema, and David Hunting, founded the Metal Office Furniture Company in Grand Rapids on a premise so simple it barely needed explaining. Steel desks don't burn. In an era when everyone smoked at work, fireproof furniture was a genuine selling point. By 1915, the company was furnishing Boston's first skyscraper. By 1937, Frank Lloyd Wright was hiring them to fabricate the enameled metal furniture for his Johnson Wax headquarters in Racine, Wisconsin. The company would be renamed Steelcase, and it would become the largest office furniture manufacturer in the world. Herman Miller, based in nearby Zeeland, hired the designer George Nelson in 1947 and invented the modern workstation, the cubicle's ancestor. Hayworth in Holland made it 3. The big 3 of office furniture, all within 30 miles of each other, would eventually have combined annual sales exceeding $6 billion. Grand Rapids was still Furniture City, but the furniture was no longer carved from the wood that had floated down the Grand River. It was pressed from steel and molded from plastic and stretched with fabric. and it was sold to corporations, not families. The old downtown, the Victorian commercial district built by the residential furniture money, was still largely standing in 1950. Monroe Avenue still had its ornate commercial facades, its iron rosettes and carved reliefs, and terracotta peacocks staring down from upper floors. Herpolsheimer's department store, a downtown anchor since 1886, was still drawing shoppers. The Powers Theater still hosted shows. The furniture showrooms still opened twice a year for the market, though the buyers were fewer now and the hotels less full. McKay Tower still stood on Louis Campaux's original lot, its 18-story silhouette the tallest thing on the skyline. The Pantlind Hotel was fading but still grand. The crystal chandeliers still hung, the gold leaf ceiling still gleamed, even if fewer people looked up at it. Heritage Hill still climbed the slope east of downtown with its 1,300 houses, its cherry trees, and its wide sidewalks, and its quiet, confident statement that Grand Rapids had once been a city worth building beautifully. The population had peaked around 176,000 and was starting to slip as families moved to new suburbs, Wyoming, Kentwood, Walker, chasing the post-war American dream of a yard and a garage and a drive to work. But the bones of the city were intact. What Grand Rapids had in 1950 was 80 years of built environment, the physical record of what furniture money and lumber money and civic ambition had created in a river town in western Michigan. And then Grand Rapids decided to tear it apart. Urban renewal arrived with federal money, expert consultants, and a civic consensus among the city's business leaders that the old downtown was the problem, not the asset. In 1949, a political crisis, the recall of Mayor George Welch, destabilized the city government and created an opening for planners and developers who wanted to remake downtown from scratch. US 131, the North-South Freeway, was constructed between 1959 and 1961 through the heart of the city, severing neighborhoods and displacing residents and businesses along its entire path. The construction of Interstate 196 followed. Blocks of small family-owned businesses, the cigar shops and shoe repair stores and lunch counters and theaters that had served downtown for generations, were condemned, purchased at prices the owners had no power to negotiate, and demolished. What replaced them was concrete, parking structures, government office buildings, and wide-open plazas designed for a civic life that never materialized because there was no longer a reason to walk downtown. The photographer Hero Bratt, who worked downtown during those years, documented the destruction in over 1,500 color slides. Every church, school, bank, and brewery photographed before and during and after demolition. He turned the images into a presentation called Glimpses of Old Grand Rapids and gave it to community groups for 12 years until he died in 1977. His son Don continued the presentations after that. The slides show streetscapes that existed one year and were vacant lots the next, the kind of systematic erasure that is almost impossible to comprehend unless you see the photographs side by side. The Kent County Courthouse, designed by Sidney J. Osgood, built between 1884 and 1890, was demolished. Block after block of Monroe Avenue storefronts came down. Buildings that had stood since the 1870s and 1880s, through the lumber boom and the furniture boom and 2 world wars, were reduced to rubble in a matter of days. Thomas Logan, a local historian who documented the losses, would later write that they had practically destroyed the downtown with the urban renewal, parking lots, and freeway projects. The buildings themselves were not irreplaceable masterpieces. Grand Rapids was not Paris. But they were the accumulated fabric of a city that had built itself honestly over decades with the money earned from making things. And when they were gone, what remained was open space that nobody needed and concrete structures that could have been anywhere. And then, in 1969, they came for City Hall. The building had been dedicated in 1888. Voters had approved its construction in 1884 at an estimated cost of $150,000, but the final bill came in at more than double that, $314,800. The architect, Elijah Myers, had given the city a building with a 3 to 4 story main structure measuring roughly 96 by 163 feet, with that 6-story Gothic tower, that belfry, those 8-foot clock dials. The building was ornate and expensive and overbuilt, which is another way of saying it was designed to last. Preservationists fought the demolition in court. They organized protests and public campaigns. In May of 1969, the building was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. But the city had already signed the urban renewal contracts, and the federal money was committed. The judge ruled that the legal challenge failed to demonstrate sufficient grounds to stop work. On October 27th, Mary Stiles chained herself to the wrecking ball. The crews raised her on the crane for one last look. Then they brought her down and began swinging. What replaced the old City Hall was Calder Plaza, a vast concrete expanse surrounded by the new International-style City Hall and the Kent County Building, both of them flat-roofed, glass and concrete structures that could have been built in any city in the country. In the center of the plaza, the city installed a 42-ton red steel sculpture by Alexander Calder, La Grande Vitesse, French for the Great Swiftness, a sly translation of Grand Rapids. It was the first public artwork funded by the National Endowment for the Arts. The NEA contributed $45,000. Private donors, led by Nancy Mulnix and Peter Weegee of Steelcase, raised the remaining $83,000. Calder built the sculpture in Tours, France. It arrived in 27 crated sections and took 5 days to bolt together. It was 43 feet tall, 54 feet long, and painted Calder's signature red. The locals hated it. Mulnix received death threats. Someone shot a bullet into her home. A letter told her that if the writer ever saw her in person, they would spit on her. So this was 1969 in Grand Rapids. The same year, the city demolished its Gothic Revival City Hall, a building designed by the architect of the state capitol, a building that had been on the National Register for 5 months. It installed a 42-ton abstract sculpture made of painted steel in the empty plaza where the old commercial district had been. The sculpture was fabricated in France and shipped across the Atlantic. It stood on ground that had once held shops and businesses owned by the families who lived in the neighborhoods nearby. The artist, Calder, had never lived in Grand Rapids. He came for the dedication and then left. The sculpture that bore the city's name in French, La Grande Vitesse, the Grand Rapids, sat on a concrete plaza in a city that had just demolished the buildings that had given the name its meaning. The old Grand Rapids, the city of carved wood, gold-leaf hotel ceilings, and turreted mansions on the hill, was being erased by the very people who had inherited it. And what they were putting in its place was abstract. The Pantlands survived the wrecking ball, but could not survive the suburbs. Through the 1970s, the 28th Street corridor south of the city exploded with new retail development, shopping centers and strip malls, and all the car-oriented commerce that was draining downtowns across America. The Pantland Hotel declined. Herpolsheimer's closed in 1987 after over a century of business. The old furniture showrooms went dark. But Grand Rapids had one thing that most declining cities did not: Amway. In 1979, the Amway Corporation, based in nearby Ada Township, founded by Rich DeVos and J. Van Andel, purchased the deteriorating Pantland Hotel and committed $60 million to its renovation. They hired the designer Carlton Varney to restore the original interiors. The gold leaf ceiling was cleaned. The Austrian crystal chandeliers were rehung. A 29-story glass tower, designed by Marvin de Winter and Associates, was added next door, rising 318 feet above the river. On September 15, 1981, the Amway Grand Plaza Hotel opened. President Gerald Ford, Grand Rapids' own, the city's most famous native son, attended the ribbon cutting with his wife Betty. The Pantlind Ballroom looked the way it had in 1925, when the hotel had been ranked among the 10 finest in America. The city around it did not. The preservation movement that Mary Stiles had embodied, though she had lost her specific battle, won the larger war. And it won it because ordinary people decided that enough had been destroyed. 6 months after City Hall came down, Grand Rapids hosted the first Michigan Historic Preservation Conference. The timing was not a coincidence. Heritage Hill, the neighborhood that urban renewal planners had once marked for demolition, 75% of its historic structures had been targeted, was saved by residents who organized the Heritage Hill Association in 1968 and fought for National Register designation, which was granted in 1971. The 1,300 houses survived. The lumber barons' mansions, the Queen Anne cottages, the Frank Lloyd Wright House on Madison Avenue, all of it was preserved. Not by the city's leaders, but by the people who lived in those houses and refused to let them go. Today, Grand Rapids has about 200,000 people in the city proper, roughly the same as in 1960. The metro area has grown past 1 million. Steelcase, Miller Knoll, and Hayworth still shape the offices where the world works. The Berkey Gay factory, that 3-block complex on Monroe Avenue, was rehabilitated in 2002 and renamed the Boardwalk Building, now filled with apartments, restaurants, and commercial space. The Calder sculpture, once despised, appears on the city's official logo, its street signs, its police cars, its garbage trucks. 500,000 people attend a festival in its honor every June. Art Prize, an international art competition that fills the city each fall, draws hundreds of thousands more. Downtown is no longer dead. But it is something else, something cleaner and newer and more generic than what was there before. The streets where lumberjacks in spiked boots once chewed up the wooden sidewalks are smooth and quiet. The showrooms where buyers from New York used to write orders for carved bedroom suites are apartments and craft breweries. The old rhythm, the twice-a-year furniture market that filled every hotel room and restaurant in town, is a memory that belongs to people who are mostly gone. Gerald Ford, who grew up on the east side of Grand Rapids, who played football at South High School and worked his way through the University of Michigan, who represented Grand Rapids in Congress for 25 years before becoming the 38th President of the United States. Ford saw both versions of the city. He saw the old Grand Rapids, the one with the Victorian storefronts and the bustling downtown. And he cut the ribbon on the new one, standing in the lobby of the Amway Grand Plaza in 1981, smiling in front of the gold leaf ceiling that Amway's money had restored, while outside the windows, the city looked nothing like the one he had grown up in. The Grand River still runs through the center of town, past the spot where Louis Campeau built his log cabin with trade goods worth $5,000 on a lot he bought for $25. Past the place where 150 million board feet of timber once jammed 30 feet high and took out 2 railroad bridges. Past the site where the old City Hall stood for 81 years before the city tore it down and put a sculpture where the tower used to be. The bells from that clock tower, the ones with the 8-foot dials, the ones that Mary Stiles was lifted above on a crane so she could see them one last time, still ring. They were saved and installed at the Grand Rapids Public Museum, where they chime on the hour, marking time for a building that no longer exists. The rapids themselves, the 18-foot drop that gave the city its name, that powered the sawmills, that drew Louis Campeau to this spot 200 years ago, were dammed out of existence over a century ago, buried under concrete and slack water. There is a plan now to tear the dams out and bring the rapids back. It would cost hundreds of millions of dollars to restore what was free when Campeau arrived.